Logic, in its general sense, is, as I believe I've shown, only another name for semiotic. Sémeiötiké, the quasi-necessary or formal doctrine of science. By describing the doctrine as quasi-necessary or formal, I mean that we observe the characters of such science as we know, and from such an observation, by a process which I will not object to naming abstraction, we are led to statements eminently fallible, and therefore, in one sense, by no means necessary, as to what must be the characters of all signs used by a scientific intelligence. That is to say, by an intelligence capable of learning by experience. As to that process of abstraction, it is itself a sort of observation. The faculty which I call abstractive observation is one which ordinary people perfectly recognize, but for which the theories of philosophers sometimes hardly leave room. It is a familiar experience to every human being to wish for something quite beyond his present means, and to follow that wish by the question, should I wish for that thing just the same if I had ample means to gratify it? To answer that question, he searches his heart, and in doing so, makes what I term an abstractive observation. He makes in his imagination a sort of skeleton diagram, or outline sketch of himself, considers what modifications the hypothetical state of things would require to be made in that picture, and then examines it, that is, observes what he has imagined, to see whether the same ardent desire is there to be discerned. By such a process, which is at bottom very much like mathematical reasoning, we can reach conclusions as to what would be true of science in all cases, so long as the intelligence using them was scientific. The modes of thought of a God who should possess an intuitive omniscience superseding reason are put out of the question. Now, the whole process of development among the community of students of those formulations by abstractive observation and reasoning of the truth, which must hold good of all signs used by a scientific intelligence, is an observational science, like any other positive science, notwithstanding its strong contrast to all the special sciences which arises from its aiming to find out what must be, and not merely what is in the actual world. A sign, or representation, is something which stands to somebody for something in some respect or capacity. It addresses somebody, that is, creates in the mind of that person an equivalent sign, or perhaps a more developed sign. That sign which it creates I call the interpretant of the first sign. The sign stands for something, its object. It stands for that object, not in all respects, but in reference to a sort of idea which I have sometimes called the ground of the representation. Idea is here to be understood in a sort of Platonic sense, very familiar in everyday talk. I mean, in that sense in which we say that one man catches another man's idea, in which we say that when a man recalls what he was thinking of at some previous time, he recalls the same idea, and in which, when a man continues to think anything, say for a tenth of a second, in so far as the thought continues to agree with itself during that time, that is, to have a like content, it is the same idea, and is not, at each instant of the interval, a new idea. In consequence of every representation being thus connected with three things, the ground, the object, and the interpretant, the science of semiotic has three branches. The first is called by Duns Scotus grammatica speculativa. We may term it pure grammar. It has for its task to ascertain what must be true of the representation used by every scientific intelligence in order that they may embody any meaning. The second is logic proper. It is the science of what is quasi-necessarily true of the representamina of any scientific intelligence in order that they may hold good of any object, that is, may be true. Or say, logic proper is the formal science of the conditions of the truth of representations. The third, in imitation of Kant's fashion of preserving old associations of words in finding nomenclature for new conceptions, I call pure rhetoric. Its task is to ascertain the laws by which in every scientific intelligence one sign gives birth to another, and specially one thought brings forth another. Logic, in its general sense, is